In April 1972, on the return leg of Apollo 16, astronaut Charlie Duke was trying to sleep in the command module when he saw a flash of light. Not outside the spacecraft, inside his own eye, with his eyelids closed. He mentioned it to the other two astronauts. Both of them had seen the same thing, not at the same moment, but over the course of the mission, all three men had been seeing flashes, bright streaks, points, sometimes what they described as fireworks, appearing inside their closed eyes in the dark with no external source. They were not the first crew to report this. They would not be the last. Every Apollo crew that traveled to the moon reported the same phenomenon. Every Skylab crew reported it afterward. Every long-duration crew on the International Space Station has reported it since. The flashes are real. The cause is now understood. But the reports from the astronauts who first described them are part of a longer list of things human beings saw, or thought they saw, or definitely saw and could not explain during the brief period in human history when 24 men traveled to the moon and 12 walked on it. This video is about that list. It is not a list of conspiracies. It is a list of observations. Most of them now explained, some of them still not fully explained, all of them recorded in the actual mission transcripts and in the post-flight debriefs the astronauts gave when they came home. The strangeness is real. The strangeness is also, in most cases, more interesting than the conspiracy versions of it. Here is what the astronauts actually saw. The light flashes are the place to start because they are the strangest thing every moon-bound astronaut experienced, and the explanation took years to confirm. The first report came from Apollo 11. Buzz Aldrin, in the post-flight debrief, mentioned seeing occasional flashes of light with his eyes closed during the translunar coast. The debriefers noted it. It was not pursued. Apollo 12 reported the same thing. Apollo 13's crew reported it during the return leg of their aborted mission, while the spacecraft was cold and dark and the astronauts were trying to conserve power. Apollo 14 reported it so consistently that the crew was asked to keep a log. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 ran formal observation sessions, periods where one or more astronauts would sit with their eyes closed in a dark cabin and report flashes as they occurred, with timing logged to the second. The reports were consistent across crews. The flashes appeared as points, streaks, or what some astronauts described as cometary shapes with a clear direction of travel. They occurred roughly every 1 to 3 minutes during the observation sessions. They were brighter and more frequent during the translunar and trans-Earth coasts than during the period spent in low Earth orbit before and after. The explanation, confirmed by subsequent research on the space station, is that the flashes are caused by cosmic rays, high-energy particles, mostly protons and heavier atomic nuclei, accelerated to enormous velocities by sources outside the solar system. On Earth, the atmosphere and the planet's magnetic field shield the surface from almost all of them. In low Earth orbit, the magnetic field still provides substantial protection. Beyond the magnetic field, which is where Apollo went, the protection is gone. When a cosmic ray particle passes through the human eye, it can interact with the retina or with the optic nerve directly. The interaction triggers a signal that the brain interprets as light, even though no light was involved. The astronaut sees a flash because the brain has no other category for a signal arrived from the visual system. The flash is real to the astronaut. It is also entirely internal. There is no light. There is a particle, and there is a brain doing the only thing it knows how to do with a visual system signal. The strangeness here is not that the explanation is exotic. The strangeness is what it implies. Every astronaut who has traveled beyond the Earth's magnetic field has had high-energy particles passing through their head, frequently enough that they can be observed in real time. The flashes are the only direct sensory evidence of cosmic ray exposure available to a human being. They are also, by implication, evidence of what every cell in the astronaut's body was being exposed to continuously for the duration of the mission. The flashes are the most reported strange experience of lunar travel. They are also the most quietly consequential one. Every long-duration crewed mission since Apollo has had to plan around the radiation environment that the flashes were the first warning of. In December 1972, Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt of Apollo 17 became the last two human beings to walk on the moon. During their second moonwalk in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, Schmitt, who was a trained geologist, the only professional scientist to walk on the lunar surface, reported something that none of the previous crews had described. He saw orange soil. The moon in every previous Apollo mission had been gray, light gray, dark gray, brownish gray, but consistently a single color family. Orange was not part of the lunar palette. Schmitt, who had spent years training to identify lunar geology by eye, knew immediately that orange soil was unusual. He called it in. Cernan came over, looked at it, confirmed what Schmitt was seeing. The orange was real. It was concentrated in a small patch near the rim of a crater called Shorty. The astronauts collected samples. They speculated on the lunar surface about what they might be looking at. Schmidt's initial hypothesis was that the orange material might be evidence of relatively recent volcanic activity. Recent in geological terms, meaning within the last 100 million years or so. This would have been a significant finding. The moon was understood at the time to be geologically dead and had been for billions of years. Evidence of recent volcanism would have rewritten the lunar timeline. The samples came back to Earth. Analysis took months. The result was both less and more interesting than the volcanism hypothesis. The orange soil was made of tiny glass beads, less than 1/10 of a millimeter across, colored orange by titanium content. The beads were not recent. They were 3.6 billion years old. They had been produced by an explosive volcanic eruption, a fire fountain similar to the eruptions seen in Hawaii today, that had thrown molten droplets high above the lunar surface. The droplets had cooled into glass as they fell, accumulated in a layer, been buried, and then been exposed again by the impact that created the Shorty crater. The orange was a window into a period of lunar history that no other Apollo site had sampled. The moon had been volcanically active in a way that produced fountain eruptions, and the eruptions had been driven by volatiles, including water, dissolved in the lunar magma. This last finding, which took decades of further analysis to confirm, was one of the first concrete pieces of evidence that the moon was not the bone-dry world it had been assumed to be. The strangeness here is a different kind of strangeness from the cosmic ray flashes. Schmitt saw something genuinely anomalous, identified it correctly in real time as anomalous, and the anomaly turned out to be a genuine scientific discovery, one of the most important made on any Apollo mission. The orange soil is the cleanest example in the Apollo record of an astronaut's eye catching something the planning had not anticipated and the catch mattering. It is also a reminder that the moon, in the small number of locations humans have visited, has produced visual anomalies that the visitors were not prepared for. The lunar surface is more varied than the gray and cratered image suggests. Most of the variation has not been sampled yet. This is the report that surprises people the most because it does not fit the picture of what the moon is. The moon has no atmosphere. There is nothing to carry a smell. And yet, every Apollo crew that walked on the moon reported that the lunar surface had a distinctive odor. The astronauts could not smell the moon directly. They were in suits, but the lunar dust clung to everything, to the suits, to the tools, to the sample bags. And when the astronauts returned to the lunar module and repressurized the cabin, the dust came in with them. When they took their helmets off, they could smell what they had brought back inside. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across crews. Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11 said the dust smelled like wet ashes from a fireplace. Gene Cernan on Apollo 17 said it smelled like spent gunpowder. Harrison Schmitt on the same mission used the same gunpowder comparison and added that the smell was strong enough that he had what he called a lunar dust hay, fever reaction, congestion, irritation, watering eyes, that lasted for hours after the second moonwalk. The Apollo 12 crew, the Apollo 14 crew, the Apollo 15 crew, and the Apollo 16 crew all reported variations of the same description: burnt, spent, ashen, something between gunpowder and a wet fireplace the morning after a fire. The strangeness of this report is twofold. First, the moon does not contain anything that is actually similar to gunpowder. Gunpowder smells the way it does because of sulfur and carbon compounds produced in combustion. Lunar dust contains some sulfur and some carbon, but not in the form or concentration that would produce a gunpowder smell on Earth. Second, the smell faded. When the samples were brought back to Earth and opened in laboratories, the dust did not smell like gunpowder anymore. It barely smelled like anything at all. The current explanation involves the chemistry of the lunar surface and the chemistry of return to a pressurized environment. The lunar surface is bombarded continuously by the solar wind, a stream of high-energy particles from the sun. The bombardment over billions of years leaves the topmost layer of lunar dust in a chemically activated state. The dust grains have unsatisfied chemical bonds on their surfaces, dangling from being broken by the constant micrometeorite impacts and the radiation environment. On the moon, in vacuum, those unsatisfied bonds stay unsatisfied. There is nothing for them to react with. When the dust is brought into a pressurized cabin with oxygen and water vapor, the unsatisfied bonds find something to react with. The reactions are rapid. They produce, briefly, compounds with smells, including compounds in the family that would account for the gunpowder description. The reactions exhaust themselves within hours because the supply of unsatisfied bonds is finite. By the time the dust reached Earth, it had been reacting with cabin atmosphere for days, and the active chemistry was done. The samples that arrived in laboratories were chemically inert versions of what had smelled so distinctly inside the lunar module. This explanation is well supported but not fully proven. The exact compounds responsible for the gunpowder smell have not been definitively identified. The chemistry would have to be re-examined in situ on the lunar surface to be confirmed, and no mission since Apollo has been positioned to do that. The strangeness here is not just the smell itself. It is what the smell reveals about the lunar surface as a chemical environment. The moon is not just dusty. The moon is covered in dust that is, in chemical terms, halfway through a reaction it cannot finish because there is nothing on the moon to finish it with. The astronauts who walked on the lunar surface walked through a layer of material that wanted to react with their atmosphere, and did the moment they gave it the chance. A future lunar base with humans living continuously inside pressurized habitats will have to manage this. The dust will come in with the crews. The crews will smell it. They will also, depending on how the habitat is designed, breathe particulate matter from it, and the long-term health effects of inhaled lunar dust are not well characterized. The Apollo crews were exposed for hours. A base crew will be exposed for months. The gunpowder smell is the first warning of a problem that lunar architects are now trying to solve before it has to be solved by experience. Reports of transient lights on the lunar surface, flashes, glows, brief brightenings, predate the Apollo program by more than 300 years. They have a name. Astronomers call them transient lunar phenomena, or TLP. The catalog of historical reports is large and uneven. Some entries are clearly observational errors, atmospheric effects in Earth's atmosphere, rather than anything on the moon. Some are likely impacts, small meteoroids hitting the lunar surface and producing a brief flash visible from Earth, a phenomenon that has since been confirmed by dedicated monitoring programs. Some entries describe glows or colored patches that persisted for minutes, which impacts cannot explain. The Apollo astronauts were briefed on the TLP catalog before flight. They were asked, when possible, to look at locations where transient phenomena had been historically reported and to note anything unusual. The reports they brought back are the most credible TLP observations in the set's historical record because they came from trained observers looking at the moon from above its atmosphere with no Earth atmosphere in the way. The most discussed Apollo TLP observation came from the Apollo 17 crew. While in lunar orbit, the crew was asked to look at a crater called Grimaldi, where ground-based observers had reported glows for decades. The astronauts reported a brief flash near the crater's edge. They could not characterize it further. It was too brief and too small to study from orbit, but they confirmed that something had happened in approximately the location and of approximately the kind that ground-based observers had been reporting. Apollo 11 reported during the translunar coast observing a brightening near the crater Aristarchus, another location with a long history of TLP reports. Mission Control, alerted to the report, asked ground-based observers to look at Aristarchus. Several confirmed a brightening at approximately the same time the astronauts had reported it. These reports do not prove that transient lunar phenomena have a single cause, or that they are all the same phenomenon. They probably are not. The current understanding is that the TLP catalog mixes at least 3 distinct things: meteoroid impacts, which are now confirmed and routinely observed, outgassing events where pockets of gas trapped beneath the lunar surface escape and briefly create a visible disturbance, which is plausible but not yet directly confirmed, and electrostatic effects where the lunar surface, charged by solar wind and ultraviolet light, occasionally discharges in ways that may produce brief glows, which is hypothesized but speculative. The strangeness here is that the moon, which is conventionally described as geologically dead, is not entirely quiet. Things happen on the surface. Most are small. Some are visible from Earth. A few have been observed from lunar orbit. The catalog is incomplete. The explanations are partial, and the only way to improve either is to have continuous monitoring of the lunar surface from a position close enough to see clearly. That capability does not yet exist. It will exist once the next generation of lunar orbiters and surface stations is in place, which is one of the quieter scientific consequences of the construction phase the previous video described. This is the section that needs to be handled carefully, because it is the section where the conspiracy literature has done the most damage to the actual record. There are no astronaut reports of alien spacecraft on the moon. There are no suppressed transcripts. There are no Apollo astronauts who came home and said, on the record or off it, that they had seen evidence of extraterrestrial activity. The conspiracy versions of these reports are with few exceptions either fabricated, mistranslated, or stripped from context that explains them. What there are in the actual record are reports of unidentified objects, things the astronauts saw, could not immediately identify, and reported because reporting anomalies was part of their job. The most famous of these came from Apollo 11. During the translunar coast, Buzz Aldrin reported observing an object that appeared to be pacing the spacecraft. The object was visible through the optical instruments. It moved in a way that suggested it was at a similar velocity to the spacecraft, which is what pacing means in this context. Aldrin reported it to Mission Control. The crew tried to characterize it. They could not definitively identify it during the mission. Aldrin has since explained in multiple interviews and in his own writing what the object almost certainly was. The Saturn V's third stage, the part of the launch vehicle that had propelled the spacecraft out of Earth orbit toward the moon, had separated from the spacecraft hours earlier. After separation, it had performed a small maneuver to move out of the spacecraft's path, but the maneuver had left it on a similar trajectory. The third stage was visible. It was at a distance that made it difficult to size accurately. It was moving in a way that, from the spacecraft's frame of reference, looked like pacing. Aldrin has been explicit repeatedly that he does not believe the object was anything other than the third stage. He has also been explicit that the conspiracy literature has consistently misrepresented his report, taking the moment of uncertainty during the mission and presenting it as a moment of identification of something extraterrestrial. The actual record contains the uncertainty, the post-mission explanation, and Aldrin's own decades of clarification. The conspiracy literature contains only the uncertainty presented out of sequence. Similar patterns apply to almost every other object report from the Apollo program. Apollo 12's crew reported unidentified flashes through the windows during the translunar coast. Almost certainly the cosmic ray flashes described in Part 1, observed before the phenomenon was understood. Apollo 16's crew filmed an object during a moonwalk that conspiracy literature has presented as a UFO. The object is, on examination of the unedited footage, a piece of the lunar module's own structure caught in a panning shot. Apollo 14's Edgar Mitchell, who became publicly associated with extraterrestrial hypotheses in his later years, never reported seeing anything unidentified during his actual mission. His later statements about extraterrestrial visitation were based on conversations with other people, not on observations he made on the moon. The honest summary is this: the Apollo astronauts saw things they could not immediately identify because they were operating in an environment human beings had never operated in before, and unfamiliar things are by definition initially unidentified. In every case where the record is complete, the things were later identified as spacecraft components, as cosmic ray events, as optical artifacts, as visual misinterpretations of unfamiliar geometry. The unidentified did not stay unidentified. It became identified, and the identification has been on the public record for decades. The strangeness here is not what the astronauts saw. The strangeness is what the conspiracy literature did with what the astronauts saw. The actual reports are sober, well-documented, and resolved. The literature that surrounds them is not. This section is the shortest one in this video because the actual content is shorter than the surrounding mythology suggests. The Apollo astronauts did not see aliens. They saw, on multiple occasions, things they could not immediately identify, and they reported those things because they were professionals doing their jobs. The reports are interesting. The conspiracy versions of the reports are not interesting because they are not true. The last category is the one the astronauts themselves had the most difficulty describing because it is not an observation of an external phenomenon. It is an observation of what being on the moon was like. Every Apollo astronaut who walked on the lunar surface in the post-flight debriefs and in subsequent interviews described some version of the same experience. The moon did not look the way it looked in the photographs. The photographs show a gray landscape, evenly lit, with sharp shadows and a black sky. The astronauts describe something different. They describe a landscape where distances were impossible to estimate because there was no atmosphere to provide the haze cues human eyes use to judge depth. A mountain that looked a kilometer away was 10 kilometers away. A boulder that looked like it could be picked up was the size of a house. The astronauts trained for this in simulation, and the training helped, but the actual experience on the surface was, in their description, persistently disorienting in a way that the training had not fully prepared them for. They describe a sky that was not just black, but in their words, absolutely black. A quality of blackness that has no equivalent on Earth, because even the darkest Earth sky has some scattered light. The lunar sky, in daylight, with the sun above the horizon, is black in the way that the inside of a sealed box is black. The contrast with the brightly lit ground is, in the astronauts' descriptions, the single most consistently startling visual feature of being on the moon. They describe the Earth, when they could see it, as small. Photographs of the Earth from the moon show a blue marble that looks substantial in the frame. The astronauts describe looking up and seeing something they could cover with a thumbnail held at arm's length. The smallness was not abstract. It was the specific, immediate visual fact of looking at the place where every human being who had ever lived, except for the 11 other men who had made the trip, was located. 12 men have stood on the moon and looked at the Earth. The descriptions they brought back of that specific experience are remarkably consistent and remarkably difficult to convey in words. The astronauts have generally said that the photographs do not capture it. The film does not capture it. The descriptions and interviews do not capture it. The thing that the experience was is not transmissible by the means available. This is the strangest category of report in a specific sense. It is the category where the strangeness is real, well documented across all 12 men who experienced it, and not explainable by reference to any external phenomenon. The strangeness is in the experience itself. The moon, as a place to stand and look around, is strange in ways that the photographs and the films do not show, and the astronauts have spent the rest of their lives trying with limited success to describe what the difference was. This is also the category that the next generation of lunar explorers will have the opportunity to extend. The Apollo crews stayed on the surface for hours and days. The next crews will stay for weeks and months. The reports that come back from those missions about what the moon looks like, what it feels like to be there, what the experience does to the people who have it, will be the first new data on this question in more than 50 years. 6 categories of strange observations from the men who went to the moon. The flashes inside their eyes. The orange soil that turned out to be older than Earth's oceans. The gunpowder smell that revealed the chemistry of a surface halfway through a reaction it could not finish. The lights on the surface that the historical catalog had recorded for centuries, and that the astronauts confirmed from a vantage no one had occupied before. The unidentified objects that became identified despite what the literature around them claims. The experience of being on the moon itself, which all 12 men who had it described as fundamentally different from any photograph or film of the place. None of these categories require an extraterrestrial explanation. All of them are more interesting than the extraterrestrial versions, because all of them are real, documented, and in most cases, partially understood. The moon as an environment is strange enough that the conspiracy framings underestimate it rather than overestimating it. The actual reports are stranger than the invented ones, and they have the additional property of being true. The reports are also, almost all of them, 50 years old. The 12 men who walked on the lunar surface walked there between July 1969 and December 1972, a window of 41 months, after which no human has returned. The strangeness they reported is, for now, the only strangeness humans have brought back from the moon. That is about to change. The next humans to stand on the lunar surface will be there before 2030. They will stay longer than the Apollo crews did. They will go to places: the South Pole, the permanently shadowed craters, the peaks of eternal light, that no Apollo mission visited. The reports they bring back will extend, and possibly revise, the list this video has described. The strange things that human beings have seen on the moon are not a closed catalog. They are the first chapter of a catalog that has been paused for half a century and is about to resume.